the private dining room at Meridian, tucked behind a lacquered door on the second floor of one of Vancouver's most quietly expensive restaurants, was the kind of place where the lighting had been calibrated to make everyone look like they were worth more than they actually were. Heavy linen, crystal that caught the candlelight, a view of the harbor that cost the restaurant more in property taxes than most people made in a year. The room existed to make deals feel inevitable, to smooth the rough edges off negotiation with Wagyu and aged Burgundy and the particular silence that only money could buy. Zara Mehta had worked that room for 2 years without anyone in it ever learning her name. That was fine. That was the job. You moved quietly. You refilled without being asked. You read the table the way you'd been trained to read a room. Who was nervous? Who was performing? Who actually held the power? Zara was good at it. Frighteningly good, her floor manager Raymond had told her once, in the distracted tone of someone paying a compliment they hadn't meant to give out loud. What Raymond didn't know, what none of them knew, because Zara had learned early that it was better not to say, was that she had spent 3 years in the UBC Faculty of Law before she'd had to leave. A scholarship that had felt, for a brief and luminous time, like the beginning of everything. She spoke 4 languages, 2 of them fluently enough to dream in. She had once, in her 2nd year, won a moot court competition that her professor had called the finest performance he'd seen in 20 years of teaching. She was 29 years old, and she was carrying someone else's breadbasket, and she had stopped explaining why a long time ago. Her mother's diagnosis had come in March of Zara's 3rd year. Aggressive, expensive, the kind of illness that didn't negotiate with your plans. Her younger brother Tariq was 16 and needed someone to stay. Her father had been gone since Zara was 11, gone in the slow way, not the sudden kind, the way that left more damage, because it happened so gradually. You almost convinced yourself it wasn't happening at all. There was no one else. There had never been anyone else. So Zara had deferred, and then deferred again, and somewhere in the 2nd deferral she had understood, with the quiet grief of someone accepting a door closing, that she was not going back. The medical bills were, by now, the kind of number she didn't look at directly. Like the sun, better approached sideways. Meridian paid well for fine dining. The clientele tipped well when they were in good moods, which depended entirely on whether the deal had gone their way. Zara had learned to read the endings of evenings the way a weather forecaster reads pressure systems. Tonight, when she'd been assigned to the Breckenridge party, she'd felt something she couldn't name. A low-frequency unease, like the air before a storm. The booking was under Mitchell Breckenridge, which meant nothing to her until she saw the name on the confirmation sheet next to his Yuna Chai, Seoul. Executive Director, Chai Holdings International. Zara had set the table with her usual precision and gone to check the private bar stock and hadn't thought much more about it. She thought about it now. Breckenridge arrived first with a man named Tolliver. She'd caught the name from the reservation notes. Cole Tolliver, listed as associate in the way that sometimes meant lawyer and sometimes meant enforcer and sometimes meant both. They were the kind of men who wore their confidence like a 2nd suit, and both of them had the particular ease of people who had never, in their adult lives, been told to wait for a table. Breckenridge was in his mid-50s, silver-haired, handsome, in a way that had probably opened a great number of doors. Tolliver was younger, sharper-jawed, with eyes that moved around the room, cataloguing exits and advantages. They ordered scotch before Zara had finished the water. Neither of them acknowledged her as a person, which she'd long since stopped taking personally. To certain categories of client, she was ambient, part of the room, like the chandelier. She's flying in from Seoul, Breckenridge said to Tolliver, adjusting his cufflinks. Direct to Vancouver. No stopovers. Does she have counsel with her? Her assistant said no. It's an exploratory meeting. She wants to see the proposal before she brings in her team. He picked up the scotch and swirled it. That's the window. Zara moved to the sideboard and began arranging the amuse-bouche service. Her back was to them. Her ears were not. The arbitration clause is on page 14, Tolliver said. Subclause, standard font, nothing flagged. Her team won't see it until after signing, and by then the jurisdiction locks in and the revenue-sharing amendment buried in the Schedule C addendum. 11 pages in. Nobody reads Schedule C. Breckenridge smiled. It was the smile of a man who had been doing this for a long time and had never once been caught. She's building a distribution network for Western Canada. She needs us more than we need her. She'll sign. Zara set down a ramekin with more care than was strictly necessary to keep her hands from doing something she'd regret. She had, in her second year of law school, written a 40-page paper on unconscionable contract clauses in cross-border commercial agreements. She had received a 94. Her professor had recommended it for publication in the faculty journal. She knew exactly what page 14 looked like. Yuna Chai arrived 20 minutes later, and the room changed the way rooms do when someone genuinely formidable walks into them. She was in her late 40s, with close-cropped hair and a kind of posture that suggested years of deliberately not making herself smaller in rooms that expected her to be. She wore a charcoal blazer over a silk blouse, the color of deep water, and she carried nothing except a slim leather portfolio and the particular composure of someone who had, in the course of building a company from a regional logistics firm into an international enterprise, learned that stillness was a form of power. She greeted Breckenridge in English, careful, precise, accented in the way of someone who learned the language as a professional tool rather than a cultural inheritance. She shook Tolliver's hand without warmth. She sat down and placed her portfolio on the table and folded her hands over it and waited. Breckenridge launched into his presentation with the polished energy of someone who had given it many times. Numbers, projections, the particular Canadian modesty that was actually just arrogance wearing a parka. Tolliver interjected occasionally with figures. A laptop appeared. Slides. Zara worked the room the way she always did. Unhurried, unobtrusive, her attention split between the technical requirements of the service and the conversation she was absorbing at frequencies that the men at the table had long since stopped accounting for. Yuna Che asked questions in English, good ones, the kind that came from genuine understanding rather than the performance of it. But something was happening that Zara noticed, and the men clearly did not. There were moments, not frequent, but there, when Yuna paused slightly longer than the rhythm of the conversation required. When Breckenridge used a compound phrase or a piece of industry jargon, there was a half-second of processing that he was interpreting as thoughtfulness and that Zara was reading as something different. The nuance was getting lost. Not the substance. Yuna Chai was sharp enough to follow the substance in any language, but the texture, the subtext, the precise meaning of certain phrases that didn't translate cleanly. Reasonable best efforts. Material adverse change. Words that sounded like plain English and were, in fact, a legal dialect with a specific and consequential grammar. And on page 14, in subclause C, in standard font, there was a mandatory arbitration clause that designated Alberta as the jurisdiction for all disputes, a detail that, for a Korean company building a Western Canadian distribution network with assets primarily in British Columbia, was not a neutral choice. It was a trap dressed in paperwork. Zara refilled the water glasses. Her face was, as always, professionally pleasant. Her mind was running through the Commercial Arbitration Act, the cross-border implications, what it would mean for Che Holdings to sign with that clause intact, what it would mean for the woman across the table who had flown from Seoul with a portfolio under her arm, and the kind of careful dignity that did not deserve to be dismantled by two men who had planned this before she'd even landed. She poured the burgundy. She thought about Tariq, who was 22 now and had just started his first year at SFU on a partial grant and needed the rest covered. She thought about the hospital bill on the counter at home that she'd flipped face down 3 mornings ago. She thought about her mother, who had survived against the odds and who still asked every Sunday when Zara was going back to school, and to whom Zara always said, "Soon, Mama, soon." She set the burgundy bottle down. She thought, I could lose this job. She thought, I know what's on page 14. The moment arrived the way moments like that always do, not dramatically, but quietly. In the middle of something mundane, Breckenridge had slid a printed copy of the proposal across the table and was directing Yuna Chai's attention to Schedule A, talking about timelines, talking about revenue projections, performing the confident warmth of someone whose confidence came from knowing the real danger was somewhere else entirely. Yuna Chai opened the document and began reading. Zara was at the sideboard. She was supposed to bring out the 3rd course. She had the plate in her hand. What happened next, she would think about for a long time afterward. Not the decision itself. The decision had been made somewhere below the level of conscious thought. In the part of her that had sat in a moot courtroom at 22 and argued an unconscionable contract case and won. In the part of her that had watched her mother sign hospital paperwork without reading it because she'd been too frightened and too tired, and no one had slowed down enough to explain it to her. She set the plate down quietly on the sideboard. She stepped toward the table. "Miss Chai," she said. Her voice was level, professional. The tone she used when informing guests of an allergy issue or a kitchen delay. The tone of someone delivering necessary information. The table stopped. Breckenridge turned with the particular irritation of someone being interrupted at exactly the wrong moment. "We're fine, thank you. Before you reach page 14, Zara said, still looking at Yuna Chai, "there's something you should be aware of." The silence in the room was a specific texture she had heard. Silences like it in shifts. The silence before something shifts. Breckenridge's voice dropped to a register she recognized, the register of someone who was very used to having control and was feeling it loosen. "This is a private business dinner. I'd suggest you..." Subclause C, on page 14, Zara said, designates Alberta as the mandatory arbitrations jurisdiction for all contractual disputes. For a company operating primarily in British Columbia, that's a material disadvantage that would likely not be flagged until after execution. She was speaking to Yuna Chai. Only to Yuna Chai. The men at the table had ceased, for the purposes of this conversation, to matter. There was a pause. Yuna Chai looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time, as something other than ambient, and then she turned to page 14. "That's quite enough." Breckenridge was on his feet now, not loudly but firmly, the way men like him moved when they decided something was over. "I'll need to speak to your manager. That's absolutely your right," Zara said. She had not moved. She had not raised her voice. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was not afraid. Yuna Chai read subclause C. She read it twice. Then she turned to Schedule C 11 pages in, and she read that too, in a silence so complete that Zara could hear the harbour wind against the glass. When she looked up, she looked at Breckenridge. She did not say anything. She closed the document. In Zara's experience, all of it, the 3 years of law school, the 2 years of this floor, the 29 years of being a person in rooms that had not been built for her. Silence from someone like Yuna Chai was louder than any argument she had ever heard. Raymond appeared at the door 3 minutes later, summoned by some signal Zara hadn't seen Breckenridge send. Raymond was a good floor manager, which meant he was, above all things, discreet, and he assessed the situation with the rapid accuracy of someone who had been managing fine dining disasters for 15 years. He read Breckenridge's rigid posture, Tolliver's carefully neutral expression, Yuna Chai's closed document, and Zara standing in the middle of it like a person who had done something and was prepared to stand behind it. "Ms. Mehta," he said quietly. "A word, of course." She followed him to the anteroom. Through the door she could hear Breckenridge beginning in a controlled voice to tell Raymond what had happened, or rather his version of what had happened, which was the version in which a server had inserted herself uninvited into a private business negotiation and interfered with a contractual process. Raymond was looking at her with an expression that was not, she noted, angry. It was something more complicated. "Is what you said accurate?" he asked. "Yes, you're certain. I spent 3 years studying commercial law at UBC before I had to leave. I'm certain." Raymond processed this with the stillness of someone who had just found out that the person he'd been scheduling for Tuesday lunch shifts had been reading the room at an entirely different frequency than he'd understood. He looked at the door. He looked at her. "Breckenridge wants you removed from the floor." "I understand, Zara." He stopped. He rarely used her name. Was she going to sign it? She thought about the half-second pauses, the precise, careful English that was missing the grain of the legal vocabulary, the document open on page 14, while 2 men watched from across the table like they were waiting for a timer to run out. "Yes," she said. Raymond looked at the door again for a long moment. Then he straightened his jacket. "I'll handle Breckenridge," he said. "Go take your break." It was not, she understood, a dismissal. It was the most diplomatic thing he could have done. She was in the staff corridor, sitting on a wooden bench with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking when the door from the dining room opened and a woman she hadn't expected to see walked through it. Yuna Chai had the portfolio under her arm. She had clearly told the hostess something, or simply moved through the restaurant with the quiet authority of someone who had stopped asking permission for things a long time ago. She stopped in front of Zara. "You were the one serving our table," she said. "Yes, you are a server here." "Yes." Yuna Chai looked at her for a moment with an expression that Zara couldn't entirely read. Not quite assessment, not quite curiosity, something that combined the two. It was not a question. 3 years, UBC. I had to leave. Zara paused. Family situation. My mother was ill. And now, Zara looked at her coffee cup. "Now I work here. It pays well." Yuna Chai was quiet for a moment. Outside, in the distance, a float plane crossed the harbor in a low arc, its lights blinking against the dark. "I have been building a distribution network in Western Canada for 2 years. Yuna Chai said, in the careful, precise way that meant she was choosing her words with the same attention she gave to contracts. "I have a legal affairs coordinator in Seoul. She is excellent, but she is in Seoul, which means she is not here, which means that when I am in a room in Vancouver at 9 in the evening and someone hands me a document, I am relying on translation and instinct." She paused. "Tonight my instinct told me something was wrong, but I could not have told you where." Zara said nothing. "The clause you identified," Yuna Chai said, "between $2 and $4 million in the event of a dispute, in additional legal costs alone simply due to jurisdiction, not including the arbitration delays, not including the strategic disadvantage of litigating outside British Columbia." "I know," Zara said. "I know you know." Yuna Chai studied her. "That is why I'm here." What followed was not a long conversation. Yoona Chai was not, Zara quickly understood, someone who made speeches. She was someone who made assessments and then acted on them, with the directness of a person who had learned that directness was more efficient than performance. She needed someone in Vancouver, not a law firm. She had those. She needed someone who could sit in a room and read a document in real time, who understood the local legal landscape, who had the instincts of a lawyer without the billable hour clock, running a legal affairs liaison. She'd been thinking about it for a year. She had not found the right person. "I would want you to finish your degree," Yoona Chai said. "I would expect that. The role would be structured around it. Who's to UBC's evening program?" "I know about the evening program," Zara said, quietly. "Then you know it's possible." Zara looked at her. She was aware, distantly, that there was a plate of cooling on a sideboard in the room next door, that Raymond was somewhere managing the fallout, that her phone had 2 texts from Tariq she hadn't read. She was aware that she had been sitting on this bench in a staff corridor with the ambient smell of kitchen stock and industrial cleaner and a cup of coffee going cold, and that something was happening that she did not entirely have language for. "My mother's medical bills," she said. It was not the thing she'd meant to say, and she said it anyway. "I have debt, real debt. It would affect what I can." "It would be a salaried position," Yoona Chai said, "with benefits. If the debt is the obstacle, we can discuss an advance against the first year." She said it the way she'd said everything. Without drama, without generosity performed for an audience, as a practical matter between 2 people in a corridor. I did not fly from Seoul to be outmaneuvered by a boilerplate clause. I would prefer not to be in that position again. Zara looked at the floor for a moment. She thought about her mother, who every Sunday asked about law school, with a hope that had not, in 6 years, diminished. She thought about Tariq, who was 22 and studying, and did not need to carry what she had been carrying alone. She thought about the paper she'd written in 2nd year, the one on unconscionable contract clauses, the one that had been published in the faculty journal, that she still had a PDF of on her phone because she had never been able to entirely let it go. She looked up. "I'd need 2 weeks' notice with Raymond," she said. "He's been fair to me." Something moved across Yoona Chai's face that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "2 weeks is reasonable," she said. Breckenridge and Tolliver left without signing anything. Raymond told Zara the following morning, in the same distracted tone he'd used when he'd called her frighteningly good, that they had been politely asked not to rebook the private room for the foreseeable future. He did not say why. He didn't need to. She had worked that floor long enough to understand how quietly and how permanently certain doors could close. The dinner that night went into no record. The room was reset by 11. By midnight, the linen had been changed, and the crystal re-washed, and the harbour's doing its patient work again on whatever came next. In the staff locker room, before she left, Zara sat for a moment with her phone. She opened her texts. Tariq had sent a photo of his campus library, a joke about how late he was working, the kind of joke you only made when things were actually going okay. She typed back a response, and then sat for a moment more. Then she opened her email and, for the first time in 2 years, navigated to the UBC Faculty of Law website. The evening program application deadline was 8 weeks away. She put her phone in her jacket pocket and zipped it closed, and walked out through the back of Meridian into the cool Pacific air, the smell of salt water and cedar, and the particular darkness of a Vancouver night when the clouds sit low over the mountains. The city moved around her the way cities do, indifferent, continuous, full of its own concerns. Somewhere across the water, the lights of North Van made their quiet reflection. She had, she thought, been reading rooms her whole life, knowing who held the power, knowing what was not being said, knowing where the clause was buried that would cost you everything if you signed without seeing it. It had taken her until tonight to understand that this was not a thing she had to keep doing for other people, invisibly, from the sideboard. She flagged down a cab on Hornby Street and gave the driver her mother's address. Sunday was 2 days away, but there were things she had been saying soon to for long enough. It was time to say something different.